In our daily lives, information just comes at us constantly. It feels relentless sometimes. Every notification, every headline, conversations, it all just piles up. It's really easy to feel overwhelmed. So the question is, how do you cut through all that noise? How do you actually get well informed without having to sift through, well, everything yourself? That's really our mission today, to give you a clear path, kind of a shortcut to understanding what truly matters. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a really compelling discussion. It's about the power our thoughts have in shaping our reality, and also the subtle but, wow, pervasive influence of the ego and what it genuinely means to, cultivate a higher consciousness.
Yeah, and the insights we're drawing on today, they come from this really rich audio discussion. It was recorded at a recent retreat. So it offers this unique blend of, let's say, spiritual wisdom and some pretty practical insights into how our minds actually work, neuroscience even.
Exactly. So, our mission for you listening is to distill the most important nuggets of knowledge from this conversation. We want to give you practical takeaways for understanding and consciously creating these new mental tracks that can genuinely lead you toward your highest potential. Okay, so let's maybe start by just considering the sheer complexity of the brain. I mean, it's staggering. We're talking about a system with what? Billions of nerve cells, trillions of connections, constantly forming new pathways.
100 billion nerve cells,
Yeah.
100 trillion synapses. It's mind-boggling.
So, with this incredible capacity, how exactly do our brains form these patterns, these tracks we mentioned?
Well, what's fascinating here is this core principle that neuroscientists talk about. Nerves that work together, fire together, connect together. And
Mhm.
think of it like this. When you start thinking in a completely new way, there's an initial resistance, right? It's like
Hmm.
carving a fresh path through untouched ground.
Hmm.
But once you begin, you actually create a track.
Hmm.
And the more you use that track, the easier it becomes. It literally becomes a preferred route for your thoughts, your habits, everything.
Ah, okay. And the material from the retreat, it really brought this to life with some great comparisons, didn't it?
It did. Vivid ones.
Like walking in fresh snow, the first person really struggles, right? They make that visible path, but then the next person follows it and it's much easier. And pretty soon it's this well-worn trail that everyone uses.
Exactly. Or the other one they mentioned was the railway bridge shortcut, where cyclists were supposed to use a gate, take this sort of awkward, acute angle,
Right, the designed path.
the design path. But instead, they just cut across the grass because it was easier, quicker. And over time, that shortcut became, well, they called it a highway, the preferred route, totally unintended.
So these physical examples, they connect directly to our own minds then. Our
Absolutely.
thoughts, our habits, they're constantly laying down these exact kinds of tracks. So the more you think a certain way or behave in a particular manner, the more ingrained that path becomes. It gets easier and easier to follow it next time.
Precisely. It becomes the default.
Okay, so if we understand how we build these mental tracks, the really crucial question becomes, which tracks are we building? The discussion from the retreat, it offered this really powerful directive. It said, go for the highest and the best. Don't go for the second best.
Hmm. And if we connect that to the bigger picture, well, it really highlights how often we tend to underestimate our own potential, don't we? We often set these like self-imposed limits. We opt for what the discussion called halfway measures or uh, compromised methods.
Mm.
There's an analogy they used, almost like a basic education system.
Oh, right, the dog one.
Yeah, teaching hoof hoof for a dog, then maybe progressing to doggy and only finally getting to dog.
Hmm.
It's a simple illustration, but it shows how often we settle for these, superficial understandings. We end up repeating cycles of learning instead of just grasping the deeper truth right from the start.
That makes sense. So it's like we're relearning things unnecessarily.
Exactly. And this point, it extends to maybe some spiritual paths or even religions that perhaps quite unintentionally might underestimate people. They might keep followers at a more superficial level of worship, like, simply singing bhajans, these devotional songs, or praising photographs of spiritual figures.
Rather than pushing for something deeper.
Right. Rather than encouraging a direct personal experience of the divine. It's almost as if there's a belief that, well, most people won't get the deeper truth, so let's just give them this compromised method, this easier path.
Yeah. But the powerful point here, the one that really stands out, is that for those of us genuinely committed to positive change, to growth, the option is there. We can go for the highest and the best track immediately.
Yes. That's the invitation.
There's no actual need to try something middle first or settle for what they called base camp 1 if the summit, the highest potential, is truly within reach.
Which raises a really important question, though. If we're aiming for this highest track, How do we deal with the ego? Because it's always there, isn't it? The discussion brings up Darwin's principle, and it
Mm.
clarifies it. Importantly, it's not just survival of the fittest, as it's often misquoted.
Right, it's more nuanced.
It's more profoundly about the survival of those who adapt. And here's the
Yep.
really profound insight they offered. The ego is absolutely the master in the art of adapting.
Wow. Okay, that's a powerful idea. Maybe a bit unsettling.
It can be.
If the ego is that adaptable, even adapting to spiritual environments, how on earth do we spot it? How do we tell the difference between, genuine growth and just another clever ego strategy?
Well, it's incredible how it can just shapeshift. It adapts to gain validation, to get an identity in literally any environment. Think about it. In one society, people might judge you by, say, the size of your car. What does the ego do? Immediately, it wants the biggest car. It adapts.
Okay. Yeah.
In another place, maybe it's about your job title or your position. The ego adapts to that. In a military camp, everyone's looking at rank, the stripes on your shoulder. Ego focuses there.
Hmm.
At a top university like Cambridge, they mentioned, maybe it's about how many papers you've published. Ego counts the papers. It instantly figures out the currency of value and adapts to establish its identity using that currency.
Okay, I see that. But how does this play out in, say, spiritual settings? That seems counterintuitive.
But this is where it gets particularly tricky. The ego will absolutely adapt, even within spiritual gatherings. You can create a whole identity based on how many years you've been practicing meditation or how much spiritual knowledge you've piled up.
Or maybe how good you are at yoga.
Exactly. Your yoga prowess, your virtues, how humble you appear,
Yeah.
even your spiritual actions themselves, the ego can latch on to anything.
Yeah.
And the warning was, if this isn't observed, if it's just left unchecked, the ego will undoubtedly get bigger, not smaller.
So the ego has, as they put it, no problem in saying I'm a soul. It can just adopt the language.
Precisely. It can adopt the language, the practices, everything.
So how does this ego-based spiritual stuff actually manifest, and why is it such a problem if it feels good?
Well, it can create what feels like, a great sense of happiness or fulfillment, an ego-based meditation or an
Right.
ego-based practice where you genuinely think you're making spiritual progress. But the key is, it's still about the story. The discussion used the analogy of talking about Cinderella, the character in the story, not the actual actor playing Cinderella.
Okay, the persona, not the essence.
Exactly. So you might hear someone say, oh, Harry is very soul conscious. But you're still talking about Harry, the personality, the story character, not the pure underlying soul. This was referred to specifically as Base Camp 1.
Hmm.
It might feel like great intoxication, real happiness, but it's not true soul consciousness at all.
Wow. Okay, that is a key aha moment, I think. How easily the ego can kind of trick us into thinking we're on the right path, the spiritual path, when actually we're just reinforcing, well, egoic tracks.
That's the danger. So the counter strategy, the very first lesson emphasized in the discussion, is crucial. Don't mix it with ego. Don't let the ego drive the bus. The critical instruction given was start from the sky, start from the soul, not from the ego-identified self, not from,
Yeah.
Harry saying I'm going to become soul conscious. That's starting from the wrong place.
Right. Starting from the story again.
Yes,
The sources use that powerful quicksand analogy for the ego, didn't they?
they did.
That the moment you use the letter I, referring to that egoic self, that story character, you basically open the door for the ego to rush in. It sucks you down. So true spiritual practice, then, it requires a completely new beginning, a clean start, as they put it. It's like waking up to a totally different reality.
Exactly. Waking up from the dream of the ego self. The true self, in contrast, is described as an invisible traveler or invisible actor,
Yeah.
a living star. This true self is immortal. Its world, its true home is divine. It's inherently egoless, desireless, voiceless.
So different from what they call the story world.
Completely different. The story world is our physical existence, this life narrative. And that's where the vices, the ego, the desires, the sorrows all originate because of our attachment to that story, that identity. This awakening, this shift in perspective is likened to waking up from a vivid dream. Suddenly you see a completely different self, a new reality, maybe even a different eternal family. You recognize an eternal truth and a direct, undeniable connection with the divine, with God.
And the outcome of actually practicing this, of connecting with that true self, it sounds profound.
It really is.
When you genuinely manage to be, even for a moment, egoless and viceless and desire and sorrowless, you experience this deep, inherent sense of worthiness to be loved by everyone.
Yes. And worthiness to be loved by God. A feeling of almost equality with God, not in power, but in essence,
Yeah.
and this profound sense of belonging to God.
And they emphasize that even 1 minute of this genuine experience
After that.
of consciously connecting with that true invisible self, it creates a new track, a real tangible pathway in the brain.
That's right. And each subsequent minute you spend there, even if the old patterns, the old ego tracks, pull you back later,
Hmm.
that new track gets deeper, becomes stronger, more accessible each time.
That sounds incredibly transformative, but I imagine people listening might be thinking, okay, how do I do that? How do I practically implement this? Or maybe, what does aiming for the highest and best really mean for me day to day? What stands out to you from this practical side?
Well, one common concern that often comes up is this idea of perfectionism. You know, if we're always aiming for the highest, doesn't that lead to stress and burnout?
Right, trying to be perfect all the time.
Exactly. And the key distinction made in the discussion is this. Aiming for the highest is good. That's the goal. The stress, the anxiety that actually comes when the ego tries to be perfect. That's what leads to what our sources called Rayhan's reactions, this kind of self-defeating anxiety about achieving flawlessness, driven by egoic comparison or fear of failure.
So the stress isn't from the aim, but from the ego hijacking the aim.
Precisely. True spiritual intelligence isn't about the ego's relentless pursuit of flawlessness. It's the actual act of putting this starting from the sky practice into action, even if it's just for 1 minute. That's the real intelligence in action.
Okay, so it's about the practice, not an impossible standard.
Right. And it's not just about intellect either, though intellect plays a role. Knowledge, the wisdom we gain, it certainly reveals the muscle of our intellect. It shows us how to use it, how to discern. But the connection with God, with the divine, our sources explain this beautifully, that connection is like the blood supply that allows this muscle of the intellect to truly function, to be alive and effective.
Without that connection, that blood supply.
Without that connection, even with all the knowledge in the world, you risk just empowering the ego further. Or you end up with what's called a stone intellect, an intellect that's rigid, maybe sharp, but ultimately brittle, unable to truly transform or adapt with wisdom and compassion.
That makes sense. That divine connection, though, it sounds like it might sometimes put you at odds with maybe societal norms or expectations.
It certainly can.
What about situations where your inner spiritual experience clashes with what people expect externally, like concepts like humility, or maybe even how you handle grief?
Yes, the sources touch on this idea of being in this world, but not of this world. And that can indeed mean making choices that seem strange or go against social norms. Even in deeply personal situations like processing grief, your inner state, your connection, might lead you to respond differently than society expects. The key is being okay to walk alone, but with God. Understanding that your inner truth might not always align neatly with external expectations or pressures.
So navigating that tension is part of the path.
It seems so. And the core solution offered for that persistent ego trap, especially, say, when you're learning new skills and maybe even getting better than people at something, which the ego loves.
Right, the comparison trap.
Yes. The advice is simple but profound. For 1 minute, step behind the story. Step out of the role, the identity. Remember that invisible witness, that invisible traveler within you. That true self is nourished every time you do this practice. And as it's nourished, the ego naturally shrinks. It loses its grip.
So true humility isn't something you fake or put on.
Absolutely not. It emerges organically from genuine soul consciousness. It's not about faking humility or being on what was called a fake track, where the ego is just pretending to be humble for validation. And using that objective language, like invisible traveler, consistently, it helps foster a new I, a new perspective, essentially a new I. The awareness of your true egoless self.
So ultimately, that fundamental principle holds true right to the very core of this, doesn't it? Those that fire together, they connect together, they wire together.
Yes, it applies just as much to the highest form of soul consciousness as it does to any ingrained habit or thought pattern.
The track you consciously choose to lay down in your mind, the path you decide to follow, it genuinely matters. It shapes your reality. And here's where it gets really, really interesting, I think. Every single moment you spend consciously connecting with that true, invisible self, free from the ego's chatter and influence, you're actively deepening a profound new track. You're wiring yourself for a different reality.
Hmm. It's a continuous process of rewiring. And maybe here's a final provocative thought for you listening to consider. Remember that incredibly powerful statement from our sources. You are worthy to be loved by everyone. Just sit with that for a moment. Consider what it means to truly experience that profound truth, not just as an idea, not as an egoic affirmation like I am worthy, but as an inherent, undeniable quality of the desireless, egoless soul that you are. What track are you building right now that leads to that deepest experience of worthiness and belonging?